Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Zen podcast. With me in the real studio, not the virtual studio today, I've got three special guests. So we're going to have a little bit of an introduction, and then we're going to talk a little bit about security from the point of view of SD WAN. It's been an interesting conversation. There's lots to talk about. But let's start off with some introductions. So I'm just going to go around the table. We'll start with you, Enzo. Hi, Enzo. Tell us a little bit about what you do at Zen.
Yep. Afternoon, everyone. My name's Enzo Romano. Nice to meet you all. I'm one of the senior business development managers at Zen. Heavy focus on networks, and very much my focus, as you can imagine, is very much the commercial lead for complex networks within Zen, acting as that interface with our customers and looking to align their particular kind of challenges and objectives of what we can deliver. Hopefully, find a good fit and progress the conversation on from there. Really
cool. Thanks, Enzo. Dave. Hello, Dave.
Hello. So I'm Dave Yates. I'm the principal customer solutions architect at Zen for networks. I work an awful lot with Enzo. My role really is to understand customers' requirements and translate those into a solution that is built from Zen's products and services portfolio, basically.
Great stuff. Thanks, Dave. Andy.
Hi everyone, I'm Andy Dickinson. I work in service development, and I take the requirements that Dave's captured, that Enzo has sold, and I turn them into a working technical solution. So I design and build and test new products and capabilities. A lot of the time is around SD WAN, hence me being here today.
You being here. Thanks, Andy. And I'm Stu Birchall, so I look after the service development team here at Zen, and Andy's been a huge help in helping us design and roll out that SD WAN capability with Cisco. So it's a good little crowd we've got here to talk about this subject. And I think a good start point is to talk about security in general, because everyone who's listening and watching this will be aware that the cybersecurity environment is changing, and there are many more threats facing businesses and organizations. In fact, every single week, there'll be another incident and another issue. And that's not something that's going to change in the immediate future. I think for a lot of businesses, that means it's becoming a board level conversation, as opposed to something that's sitting down at the level of the IT team. It's becoming much more of an existential conversation. And that's the nature of the challenge that I think businesses are taking today. I'll come to you, Enzo, to talk a little bit about that business take on security. So, because you've been around the block a long time doing this job, what's changed in that conversation, and what are customers asking you about when we're doing work?
Yeah, it's fair to say, I think when we started off, if you kind of rewind maybe 10 years or so, I mean, I've been doing this for 19 years now, but even if we just take it back 10 years, I think the conversation in my mind seemed a lot more kind of tactical, kind of almost like a product-led conversation around, we have a firewall, we might need a newer firewall. What can you provide in terms of a newer box, an appliance-based device that can offer some level of, basic security on our network? But it's kind of evolved so much more over time now. If you kind of fast forward to today and you're having that conversation, as you said, Stu, it's very broad. It's very much a kind of a business-led, service-led conversation. I can talk about a specific example where we were invited in for a tender for a pretty large kind of retail organization. And although the tender was centered around a new network provision, where the customer, in this instance, had kind of already decided on their own SD WAN overlay provision of choice, the kind of agenda was very much kind of dominated by security, to the point where they really wanted to kind of interrogate how Zen secured its own business, how we adopted our approach to kind of security operations, and almost looking for a partner where our capability could supplement their own capability, because they were a very lean team themselves, albeit they were a massive organization. Their security team was very lean, and they were looking to kind of take lessons from how we operated to supplement the way they worked as an organization. So I think when you take it back and really strip it back, these large IT decisions, projects, very much about managing risk. It's all good and well adding value to the business, but fundamentally it's about mitigating risk to the business.
Yeah.
And from their perspective, when we really drill down into why there's so much of a focus around security, ultimately, if there's a hole in what we're doing, that then impacts on what they're doing, that's going to carry potentially a large operational and commercial impact. So for them to kind of really do their due diligence on that was far more effective than trying to kind of, let's say, negotiate an extra 5% off a network deal. It's actually looking at it more holistically to say, look, if you've got holes in the way you manage your security, it's going to have a massive impact on us. That's going to cost far more than what 5% might equate to on a network solution. So that's just a bit of insight there.
It's interesting, Enzo, that because that's quite a mature approach. Because I think one of the things I've noticed that's changed is, and the security industry is pretty notorious for this, and our head of InfoSec would be always concerned about this, is seeing security as a product, like it's a thing that you buy, as opposed to a way of working and the way you're organized and the way you train your people. There is a technology component to it, and we'll talk about that in a bit more depth later, but there's also huge amount to do with human factors, huge amount to do with organization. And that's a broad conversation, you're right, Enzo. So it's good that kind of engagement, and customers are volunteering that as well. That's quite a good thing, as opposed to seeing it as just this thing that you buy and you stick it on a shelf, you stick it at the end of it in a server room. Has that changed for you, Dave? Have those conversations tilted at all on their axis when you've been?
Yeah, there's been quite a large change over the last 4 or 5 years, I think. I would sort of apportion that to a few different things. First of all, has been the change in, to coin a phrase, the threat landscape. You know, the black hat crowd out there are much more savvy in terms of, you know, the attacks tend to be more targeted these days, far less random, much more targeted on financial gain for themselves or whoever backs them. And the scope of reputational or business damage, I think, has dramatically increased, with businesses being far more dependent on their IT even than they were 5 years ago. And so there is this, you know, to Enzo's point, there is this greater maturity. I think it's becoming a C-suite matter, as opposed to just something that the head of IT or the IT manager concerns himself with, because of the potential for, you know, essentially an existential threat to the business in worst case. So yeah, I've experienced that there is a much more, we tend to be involved more often in much more sophisticated conversations, which is more stem to stern apart, you know, in terms of how the whole business works, rather than just focusing on, as you said, a box that sits at the edge of the network and controls what your users can do on the internet. It's much more than that now. Yeah.
It's very, very true, Dave. I think that stem to stern idea of looking across the business or across the organization, it's really important. And it is an existential matter. And I think the other thing that tends to aggravate in this industry, apart from selling you a box, is the fear mongering. Okay, so, and we'll come back to this business about security being proportionate in terms of design, and this idea of security theatre, that we want to avoid putting things in that are just props, that the security tools that we implement have to be both proportionate and effective, but they can't be a hindrance. I think that's an important point. Andy, from your point of view, we've been around a long time. How's it changed from your point of view in terms of the customer?
I think it used to be quite easy because it was relatively straightforward to define the boundary and the bounds of a network. So you used to know that your network had a number of edge connections on it, sites effectively, and a limited number of ways of accessing that network. That's changed with the advent of bring your own device, home working, cloud-based services. So where it used to be that a lot of the traffic remained local to the wide area network, or the LAN as well, it now leaves the network, it goes out elsewhere, it goes externally, and you need to be able to track that traffic, you need to be able to manage that traffic, you need to be able to analyze it and secure it. I I think that's the way that it's changed, in that people are working way more flexibly than you used to.
Mm.
So this idea of a traditional network perimeter where you can draw almost a circle around your business and maybe plonk an edge firewall on that, that's a much harder thing to do today compared to what would have been the case, 5 years ago, for example.
Yeah.
And that's informing some changes in the technology as well, which I guess we'll get into when we talk about endpoint security towards the end. I just wanted to dip in a little bit before we get into the tech, because I'm keen to understand some of the differences between MPLS, which is we at Zen call IPVPN, and SD WAN, and how security is implemented differently or can be implemented differently. So I want to talk a little bit, Dave, about our general approach to design, because your team takes the requirements from the customer and then creates that high-level architecture. How does design inform the thinking generally in your group, and how do those conversations work with the customer?
Yeah. Well, in the good old days, or bad old days, depending on how you view it, of just having IPVPN, MPLS, as you say, in the toolkit, it used to be quite simple. You just had to, it was a question of sizing, so you had to size your security appliance so that it would be large enough to cope with the size of the overall estate. Things are very different now. If you look at SD-WAN, one of the main benefits of it is that you can route traffic more efficiently. So you can break traffic out locally from your site, if that's something you choose to do from an organizational perspective. And you can also route traffic via a security appliance that sits somewhere. Doesn't need to be in your data center, might be in your service provider's data center, might be just a cloud service that you just consume. So you've got to think about, again, it comes back to customer requirements. What security posture do they want? What applications do they trust? And therefore might be a good candidate to break out locally. What applications are unknown or untrusted? What are the performance requirements for those applications? It's not directly related to security, but to your point about it being proportionate security, there are some IT security professionals who would prefer everything to be switched off and therefore it's totally secure, but it has to be usable. So there has to be a full performance consideration as well. So it's a very long-winded way of saying there's way more things to consider now to build into your network design.
And I guess a lot of those things, Dave, revolve around a more precise understanding of the applications themselves, who's using them, where they're situated, and the access requirements, this kind of concept of need to know and least privilege, and how you articulate that in terms of the architecture. So it'd be good to talk a little bit about that architectural difference, I guess, Andy. And a good place to start for those who might be less familiar with SD-WAN is, well, how is SD-WAN secure in itself? Because with MPLS, traditionally, people will be used to a world of a private network that uses private infrastructure. So these are leased lines, Ethernet circuits dedicated to that customer. And therefore you have a physically private network as opposed to something that is running over public infrastructure. And that's a virtue, right? The idea that I can get my overlay across all these different services. It could be a global network. How do we secure that? I guess that's the first question. I'll come to you, Andy, on this. So it's like, how do we get a device enrolled, join in that network securely? And then how do we keep that traffic private when we're using public infrastructure?
Yeah, so the difference nowadays with SD-WAN is that you only allow trusted devices to authenticate to the network by effectively the identifier of that device, so the serial number, the model number. And usually when it's a hardware device, there'll be a fingerprint that's hard-coded into the hardware, which contains a certificate and private and public keys, which allows the device to authenticate to what's called the validator. Once the validator has accepted that device is trusted and it's allowed to join that network, so you have to pre-load that device into the overlay. It then works out what policy it's got. So the overlay will determine where to make control connections to, and also where to make data connections to. The control connections come from, there's usually a pair of controllers which manage the key exchanges in the network. So the first thing the device will do is, once it's authorized, it will connect to the controllers. The controllers will share with it some unique keys for that device. And then it will tell that device which endpoints it's allowed to connect to build a tunnel. So what that means is that the device is not open to the world. It's only open to its partner peer devices as dictated by the overlay design. So if you port scan an SD WAN device, all the ports are closed. It just opens the ports that are needed for the IP address of the remote peer and brings up the tunnels that way. And then once it's done that, all the traffic over that data connection is encrypted with AES 256 level encryption. So it's pretty secure in that everything's encrypted. All the overlay traffic is totally encrypted, which is different to MPLS, whereby everything was unencrypted and the security is inherent in the fact that it's a private network.
Yeah.
They're the main differences.
Yeah. And so what you get from that, I guess, is you get a lot of flexibility, but you'll be retaining that level of security. In fact, you could argue it's an enhanced level of security because now you have that encryption, which in an MPLS network is typically an option. Some people need it, some people don't. And given that most traffic that's traversing the internet now is TLS encrypted, there's going to be that level of security is inherent anyway. So that's good to know. And I guess the cloud infrastructure, Andy, that's acting as the controller, the management plane for the SD-WAN overlay for the customer's network, that is also locked down, secure. There's no public access to that.
Yeah, so the only device which is publicly accessible is the validator, because it needs to be able to be reached from devices which wish to join the network. That will only allow devices to talk to the network if it's been pre-authorized. So you have to have the certificates installed or the fingerprint chip to be authorized to allow it to access the network. So there's only that one entry point into the controller network.
Okay. That's good to know. And so if we think about customer requirements and types of use case, I think it would be good to have a little bit of a conversation around some of the technology relating to those use cases. I guess I'm going to come to you, Dave and Enzo, as types of customer and the specific security requirements, because it's not just a matter of I'm in a particularly vulnerable industry, or I'm a high-profile customer and I'm a target. There's this general risk now that everyone is potentially a target. Doesn't matter how big you are or how small you are. But are there common use cases that we see in terms of those security requirements or concerns? Dave, what's your take on that?
So one of the things that has changed, there's two things I think which have really changed recently. The first one is there's a much greater appreciation and wish to mitigate the potential for east-west, as we call it, sort of compromise spread. See, the typical situation there is that someone falls victim to some form of malware attack, either through phishing or some other mechanism. Their device gets compromised, and then that compromise spreads throughout the network. Something which is relatively easy to happens within MPLS because you've got full any-to-any routing by default, typically within an MPLS. So there's a much greater appreciation for the risks of having that. And I think most businesses now are in a position where they don't want full any-to-any. They want hub and spoke, generally speaking. So you have spoke isolation. Realistically, the sites, generally speaking, only will want to be able to communicate with infrastructure, if there is any, or cloud applications. There's that. The other area is a growing awareness of the risk that remote users can pose. So you can have a laptop or some other device which is off of your network potentially. Maybe the users don't need to join a VPN to to do their work because a lot of their applications are in the cloud. But in that scenario, how do you enforce a level of security, a level of filtering on that endpoint if it's not on your network? So there's quite a large focus we're finding these days on endpoint security, endpoint control, managing the risk of that endpoint, getting exposed to some form of attack, and then rejoining the network and then spreading it through like IPsec or SSL VPN. And some of that as well is driven by regulatory requirements, so like Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus are driving that requirement, even if it's only for the purpose of ticking a box, to have that risk mitigated.
Are you seeing compliance, Enzo, as being a bit of a thing with customers needing security solutions? Or
Yeah, I think just to kind of add to what Dave said around the the drive for different solutions, we can kind of pick on a specific example where a customer actually did get attacked and suffered greatly as a result of running an MPLS network, because the security kind of team that kind of helped recover that business when they were down for 2 weeks, it was well documented in the news, actually said the attack was made that much worse by the fact that the MPLS was any to any. So it's exacerbated that once they found a way in, it was able to spread throughout the network really quickly. So coming back to that point around compliance and managing risk, as well as the benefits of the proposed solution that was on the table from Zen, it was that kind of risk element that drove them to wanting to move off the existing network topology as quickly as possible, because rather than it being a fear factor of what could possibly happen, it had already happened. So all of a sudden that really fast tracked that decision to move in a particular direction. I think the other challenge as well is around, as a service provider, and again, really adding to what Dave said, is the whole SD WAN arena and the fact that kind of network footprint is spread far wider. It's that finding that balance around what you can manage effectively, and it's kind of cost versus impact, because as much as you'd love to be able to do everything as a managed service provider, there's only so far you can go with security. You can't do absolutely everything, and it's kind of defining what you can deliver in a pragmatic way at a reasonable cost that will deliver a good level of security across the board, really, for that customer. So we do a lot in retail, for example, and compliance is always a thing around PCI and things like that. So that's always at the forefront of people's mind. But from my mind, I don't know, Dave, but I think that's usually something we can kind of support quite easily, isn't it, in terms of the kind of card payment processes? I don't know if that opens up a can of worms for us around compliance.
Fortunately, these days, PCI is less of a problem than it used to be, because generally you'll find the card payment terminals are encrypted end to end, the client to server. So it sort of takes the network out of the picture in terms of compliance requirements. But there are still considerations, and typically good design practice is you have that network which those payment systems sit on completely isolated from all of the rest of the infrastructure on the site and in their network in general. The same good design rules apply to things like IoT, which is becoming more and more of a thing, insecure by design, you could almost view it as. So you've got to keep that away from your corporate infrastructure and limit what it can access, so that you don't end up in a hot mess.
I guess it doesn't become that. It's generally a challenge we can overcome fairly easily because of the power of the Cisco platform. That network segmentation is one of its key kind of strengths, isn't it, really?
It is, yeah.
Especially around Catalyst. So,
and that's an interesting one. I'll come to Andy on this, because I think with MPLS, you kind of got a bit of an either or, right? So you have a very permissive environment, which is any to any, or you can force traffic to a central location, and then you can apply firewalling to it. But what you can't necessarily have are different topologies for different applications and have that flexibility. I guess from the point of view of Cisco SD WAN, Andy, we've got more of that capability in the toolbox.
Yeah, so we can build multiple what are called overlays. So they're analogous to an MPLS network. and they can live on the same physical infrastructure. So a device might have, as Dave said, an IoT network, which is completely separate from a guest network, which is completely separate from the corporate network. But they can also traverse across the WAN if need be, separately and completely isolated. And as opposed to MPLS, which is any to any, and it's by default pretty much always allowed, unless you apply some special filtering in on the edge devices. With an SD WAN, our typical deployment would be a zero trust deployment. So nothing is allowed to talk to anything else unless we explicitly permit it. So no overlays can talk to each other anyway, by default, unless we exchange traffic between those overlays, those VPNs. And no traffic can traverse any of the tunnels unless we explicitly allow it as well at a policy level. So it's less trusting, but that obviously gives more security.
Yeah, and that's a big change, going back, say, 10 years, 15 years, when environments were typically much more permissive and open. So that's operating systems notoriously, but also, in fact, thinking back, maybe going back 10 years with AWS, so stepping outside the networks for a sec, but if you look at storage medium like S3, the very early generations of S3 storage were permissive, they were open. So unless you made specific moves to secure them, they were generally accessible. So there's a fundamental change in the posture. But when you lock things down, you're potentially introducing that inconvenience. And what I've seen happen in the past with deployments is, well, it's not working because I've got this kind of labyrinthine rule set, right? So I'll just pull a lever and let's just go to any just while I test something, right? And then neglect to tell anyone you're going to put it back, right? And so that introduces this problem whereby the security's become onerous, and so people are looking for workarounds. So how do we get that balancing out? We've got zero trust, so ZTNA, zero trust net. Now, so I'm going to stop there. Someone tell me what that definition is. Zero trust
Network
access. Okay. So we have this concept, which sounds great, but it sounds also like it could be quite frustrating. How do we avoid that frustration? And how does the technology help us avoid that frustration?
I think the key to that is good design and requirements capture. So we need to work with the customer to ensure that the protocols that they know about and they want to use and allow access from their locations to are configured. We often find when we do this that there's an application that the customer hasn't considered, hasn't thought about, wasn't aware of, which stops working when we apply this. And it's part of why one of the reasons we do pilots and proof of concepts and initial rollouts is so we can identify these things, but it's about working with the customer and collaborating with the customer. It's better to do that than, as you say, doing any rule and potentially not remove it later.
Absolutely.
It's interesting the point you made there, actually, Stu, because from a commercial point of view, when customers are looking to evaluate, network transformation, technology options, sometimes I get the feeling they're coming at it from the fact that there could be a trade-off to be made, as in, do I go for a security-first approach or vendor where potentially I'm a bit more restrictive on how I route my traffic, or do I go the other way and have something that's far more flexible from a routing perspective, but then potentially there's more of a security challenge I need to address? And I think they see it sometimes as a trade-off, or is there a compromise to be made between the two? And like you say, it comes back to that requirements capturing, offering an approach that gives the best of both worlds, because I think they see it as it's one or the other.
Indeed. Like so much else in life these days, it's either one extreme or another extreme. Right? And what we want is a happy medium. And that medium comes from that approach to the work that you two guys do in particular, is looking at it as a multi-layered thing. So security is a broad church that includes procedural work, policy, technology, people, so on. And also with different vendors. So I think there's always a tension that the vendor wants you to have everything, right? So the soup to nuts view of the world, where you buy everything under one roof. But you tend to find, I guess, I mean, like open question really, but there's always a compromise in there somewhere, isn't there? Because no one's going to be uniformly good at everything. So we have quite a relaxed approach to getting vendors involved. I think it's fair to say we're not going to say you're all going to use Cisco, you're all going to use Fortinet or whoever else we're working with.
Yeah. Our portfolio, as we all know, is largely we're a Cisco house for networking. But traditionally, we've always had the approach where we will use best of breed vendors, so whoever's the best in their particular field. Typically for security, that's been Fortinet. When we are looking at evaluating our portfolio and technical strategy for, as SD WAN develops and as our proposition develops, we are, I believe, looking around at other vendors to see what they have to offer. One that we come across quite often is Zscaler. A lot of our customers have that already. When we talk to them about potentially rolling out SD WAN with them, it's like, well, how does your solution integrate with Zscaler? And it's one of the things that actually Cisco Catalyst SD WAN does actually do quite a good job of integrating with those third parties. So fortunately for us, they're never put us in a position where it's their way or the highway. There's always a bit of flexibility there, at least.
Yeah, and it's true to say, Andy, that there is a lot of flexibility in Catalyst in terms of what we can interoperate with.
There's a lot of built-in capabilities, as Dave said, to integrate with such as Zscaler, Umbrella. But also, if there's another requirement, we can statically build IPsec tunnels to provide secure internet gateway access in the cloud. But it tends to be that the two most prevalent ones are Umbrella and Zscaler that we get asked for, which are baked into Cisco Catalyst. And effectively, you just sign up in your portal to integrate the SD WAN into that capability.
And that's the reason why we've gone for that kind of multi-vendor approach, is that we've kind of been sensitive to the fact that customers feel like they're railroaded into taking one extreme or the other. And we're trying to offer a good, sensible middle ground where you can hopefully have the best of both worlds. And hopefully offer something that has no extreme compromises built in.
Absolutely, Enzo, you're right. And I think the other benefit that we can get from the technology is that ability to make the best use of that equipment. So we're thinking about firewalls in a data center or in a cloud environment. We've got that capability to forward traffic, as you mentioned earlier, Dave, to any point in the network, almost like you teleport the packets from one place to another. And that means that you can take different applications, different user groups, and apply different levels of security depending on your needs. Is that service chaining, Andy? Am I getting that terminology right?
Yeah. I think you're describing service chain there. So it's effectively a bump in the wire. So what we can do is for a particular application or a particular network or a particular service, we can intercept it on the edge device and say, this traffic, instead of sending it through the normal routing mechanisms, we need to send it to this firewall in this particular location to treat and to decide whether it's valid or not and whether it should be allowed or it should be inspected before sending it on. So we can have a hierarchical approach as well. That means that we can designate which traffic is more trusted, which may want to break out locally using a local firewall, which doesn't have the UTM capabilities that we don't need to apply UTM capabilities because it's, for example, a Windows update, and we trust the source of that information. And then we might have the next tier, which is it's overlay traffic, and we just permit it because it's in the permitted list. So it needs to go to another site in the network. Or it's voice traffic, and we're going to permit that without any interception. But then we might not have identified some traffic. So for that traffic, we want to send it to a location which is secure for scanning, and then we can make a judgment call on it. So we can have a tiered approach to the way that we treat any traffic in the network and SD-WAN.
And whilst this all sounds great, it does sound like there's more engagement needed with the customer at a deeper level of detail than perhaps we've been used to. Has that been challenging I mean, from your point of view, Enzo, that initially, when we go back to that initial conversation with the customer, how has that level of collaboration changed? Has that provided any friction, or has it been quite straightforward to get the level of engagement that we need?
I think it'd be, if we're quite honest, it is more of a challenge, but in a positive way, because really, the fact it is less of a static kind of tick box kind of conversations in I need this, this, and this. It's more of a you're looking to challenge the customer about what's important to them, and sometimes they don't actually know until they get into that conversation, start to really think about it. So you're trying to kind of take them through a process and just coach them on their business, what's important, and sometimes it's them uncovering, lifting the hood up on what they've been operating that's built up organically over the last number of years, and suddenly they look under there and perhaps don't like what they see, and so there's that part of kind of unpicking what they have, but then it's also kind of getting them to understand what's important to them from an applications perspective, what the business needs are, what different business units requirements are, greater level of collaboration across different departments. So I think it is an ongoing process, and I think as you move through and start to test different things, you start to uncover more information. So I'd say it's definitely something that's kind of achieved over a period of time rather than a one-off conversation. Yeah. It's an ongoing engagement to really optimize and deliver the maximum benefit.
Yeah, that's good feedback. It's not a point and shoot, one shot activity anymore. No. And has that been smooth runnings for you, Dave, with customers, or has it been a bit of a?
It's a journey. It's been a journey, and I do mean that genuinely, because some customers, depending on the level of experience and their heritage, will already be aware of all of these things anyway. But we found a lot of customers who are used to MPLS, where effectively the way you treat traffic is you just stick it all on the wire. You have quads to protect stuff that's latency sensitive or packet loss sensitive, but everything just gets thrown out of the WAN interface and you don't have to think about your applications. Clear with SD WAN, it's application centric. You need to understand your applications. You need to understand what's important to you as a business, and then you overlay on security as well. Who needs to access what? You find quite often IT teams are having to think about things to a level of detail they've never had to think of before. And to Enzo's point, one of the things that we can do as a service provider, because we've been there and done that, in terms of, we've been on that journey with other customers before, is that part of our role is coaching, pointing them in the direction we see as being best practice, and just helping them along on that transition.
Yeah. And that's pointing out where there are these gaps, but not leaving them as holes. Saying there's an area you need to focus on. It's not something that we might do directly, but we may have a partner or there may be an external resource, but you need to be aware of this and take some action. So one that comes along, just in general conversation, and we've been doing it ourselves, is phishing simulations. So you look at that in terms of those entry points that begin the attack, often social engineering, often based around phishing. So very classic con. And then that's the thing that's leading a very technical exploit that might follow on behind. So it's the people problem side of it again, I guess. Just to wrap things up and talk a little bit about the future, I wanted to revisit this business about endpoint security and changing usage, patterns of engagement with the customer's end users. How are we responding to that, and how are our vendors responding to that? So, I mean, we do some with that work currently. It's something that we're developing and evolving, endpoint security. But what's the customer landscape like? What are people asking about? What are you seeing?
Yeah. So, as I say, it's a bit of a mixed picture. For some, it is around compliance. For others, it is about a genuine concern for the potential exposure that, post-COVID, people are transitioning to working remotely far more often. So in some organizations, it's the norm as opposed to the exception. And there is seen as being a bigger risk there potentially. There's articles which you can look up on the internet which talk about the shift to home working as a result of COVID in terms of several distinct phases. The initial phase being how can we have people working remotely, to the BAU transition, like this is what we do normally, to the transition where a lot of businesses are now, which is, well, how do we secure this environment now? So over the last year, 18 months, we have had far more conversations with customers, new and old, about, okay, so how do we secure these endpoints? How do we mitigate this potential risk? And this is where endpoint security comes in.
Yeah, definitely. What's your perspective on it, Andy?
It feels like it's getting to a mature state now. Until recently, I didn't think that most customers sort of understood what secure edge meant in terms of SASE, and now that it's getting to a much more well understood place, I think people know what they're asking for around remote access, zero trust network access. Why can't I remember that acronym? And those types of capabilities are all getting bundled together into products. I think until recently, most of our customers tended to use a third-party service such as Zscaler to provide that to provide some of that filtering capability and some protection on an endpoint level. So each endpoint has that client installed, and when they get any connections to anything on the internet, it uses that as a proxy service. But now that's becoming more embedded in the platforms. So I'd fully expect that over the next 12 months, we're gonna start introducing some of those capabilities natively into our SD WAN portfolio, so that we can take benefit of some of that, but not excluding things like Zscaler if the customer's already got that capability.
Yeah, definitely. There's more. It is a name that comes up a lot in conversations, and I know Cisco are investing heavily, or will be investing heavily in cybersecurity. So it'd be interesting to see where that leads. Just wanted to have some final thoughts, really on, and every time I have a security related conversation, I like to ask people about what are the 3 things you'd recommend people think about when they're thinking about securing their organization, securing their business. So apart from perhaps investing in SD WAN, you can include that as well. I'll just go around and get some parting thoughts on that. What's your advice, Enzo, for people who are listening to this, watching this, thinking about, well, how do I take the next step? Or I'm concerned about my security. Who should I talk to? And what should I think about?
So you're looking for 3 things.
Up to 3 things.
Up to
Could just be one thing.
What would my advice be? I think my advice would be understanding where you feel you're at in your current journey, trajectory as a business in regards to security. So understanding your current positioning and where you see area for improvement. So I think if you have an acceptance of that, you can, you've got a far better scope to have a much better engagement with any service providers, technology vendors. So I think it's just being truthful about your current landscape. And perhaps another area is around, the different requirements from different parts of the business and how those businesses actually engage with each other and what their view around security is. So I think it's just that kind of cross-functional view of the business. I would say the 2 key ones for me.
It's really good advice, and so I like the idea of getting an appraisal of the current state of things, right? Because it's not always obvious. It takes something like a workshop or getting those cross-functional departments together, even to get simple inventories of what you've got out there, can be a bit of a challenge. So I completely agree. I think it's good to get that baseline. Dave, any passing advice?
Well, if I was to be slightly tongue-in-cheek, I'd just say segment.
Yeah.
They're the 3 things. I do see East-West sort of compromise as being one of the biggest threats currently. If you can do all you can to prevent that, to prevent cross-contamination and keep these different IoT, guest network, corporate, networks, environments separate, I think that is a good long way towards, sort of limiting the spread of threats and compromises. So the other thing I would say is that it's not if, it's when.
Mm.
And so if you take that approach, then you accept the fact that compromise will happen.
Mm.
You understand what the runbook is in terms of mitigating against that threat, and you keep that runbook up to date,
Yeah.
and you test it.
Yeah, that's really, really good advice, Dave. I think and a lot of the vendor technologies now are focused on forensics or remediation, not just about prevention. So I wouldn't go as far as to say it's an inevitability, but if you look across time, it probably is. So it's that age-old question of, well, if this was in the public domain, whatever that given data set is, whatever that asset is, how much damage does that mean? And therefore, if you trace back, what do you need to do to protect that thing? And all the while thinking about that proportionality, because that's important in all of this. So that's really good advice. Andy, any final thoughts?
I guess encrypt everything. Trust nothing at first, so that until you explicitly want to allow it. So, assume that everything needs to be permitted only when you decide it needs to be permitted, so when you've approved it. And also physical security. A lot of people forget about physical security. There is, there is a responsibility which we can't affect, which is around physical security for the appliances that the customers might keep on their estate. And that is also something that can be used to compromise a network.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's great advice as well, Andy, because I think people tend to think about security in a very narrow, kind of black hat way, as opposed to thinking about availability, physical resilience, physical security, and they're all parts of this puzzle that we need to think about. So that's really good advice. I think from my point of view, from a technical perspective, get yourself some phishing simulations, get some training in on that. Look at your backups, make sure they're both encrypted and offline, because you need some recoverability, and patch. Just do those three things. Oh, and buy a Zen SD WAN. Well, don't have to, but I think that was really helpful, really informative. If anyone gets anything out of today, I think it's that broad conversation. And I think, Enzo, your point about getting that baseline is really important. And we can help with that conversation. We can help get that baseline, get some proportional security measures in place for your network. So very helpful. Thanks a lot for your time, guys. Speak to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.